I'm Charlie Peet, and this is my wife, Marty Peet. And the yacht Santana was built in 1935. She was 55 feet on deck, 40 feet along the water, and 9 feet below. Her famous owners included Zsa Zsa Gabor's husband, George Brent, who sold the boat to Raymond Land, and then on to Humphrey Bogart.
And we did this trip in 1971, but the boat was built in 1935. So I'm eager to tell people when they watch this film and these slides that we did this trip in a rather primitive way. We had no refrigeration, no pressure water, no self-steering gear, nothing but sextant and salt water and preservation. We collected water from the sails, and while it was challenging, it was a lot of fun. But it was primitive, so you'll appreciate that as you go through the slides.
So enjoy the films and the stories, I hope, and of our circumnavigation. In the film, you'll notice you recognize Marty very easily, and I'm the guy with the pipe and the beard.
Hi, this is Charlie Peet, son of the captain of Santana. I thought I would put together a little show here of the trip, labeled out on a globe, so you get a sense of where they went, how far they went, the basic stopping points here that he'll be talking about as he discusses the Santana trip around the world here. So I'll be showing little clips of this along the way to keep your bearings on where they are at the time. But this gives you a perspective of the actual trip all the way around the world here. Pretty amazing. So enjoy Dad's talk. It's fantastic.
Well, Marty and I, after 3 years of preparation, have come to the day of departure, January 31st, 1971. We're here at the St. Francis Yacht Club, and our departure time is 5 o'clock this afternoon, where we leave the dock and head west, hopefully, around the world. Before we can depart, we have to get permission from Spike Africa, who's the president of the Pacific Ocean, who was also Sterling Hayden's first mate on the yacht Wanderer when he got in all kinds of trouble for stealing his kids. But he's a wonderful guy, a great old sailor, and actually sailed around the Horn to get to San Francisco as a young child. And he hands us a scroll as his permission to enter the Pacific. So with this scroll, we now back out, and 4 of us, Ruth Cascadden, Jim Leach, Marty, and I, for our epic voyage around the world. And as we leave, a group of sailboats joins us to say goodbye as we head for the Golden Gate Bridge and our first night at sea. Let's go down below and see what's hiding in Santana. Here's a commission on the wall of the head door, which we got from the government, authorizing and commissioning us to sail around the world. We were very basic down below. Our refrigerator worked with ice. That was about it. And our stove was a little 2-burner propane with a little oven. And Marty did a marvelous job, I must say, on supplying us with the best prepared food in the world. On we see a little liquor cabinet, which was put there by our previous owner, Humphrey Bogart, who was known to have a drink periodically. Our most important crew member, who traveled all the way around the world with us, and whose father was my best friend, and this is young Jim Leach, who was a sailmaker. I think he was about 20 years old when we left. wonderful, wonderful sailor. We go on to look around the main salon down here, and there's a dinette, a little table, and so forth. Then we're back up on deck. It's morning now, and I'm at the helm with my dark glasses there and my beanie, headed south. We're headed for the coast of Mexico and on to Acapulco. On our way, we spot whales. Nothing like a whale spouting out at sea. And also there was a race going on, a race to Cabo San Lucas. No, the race was going to Puerto Vallarta. And this boat is racing, and it's very, very light wind. That's the racing crew that we're sailing past. And after we went past them, we had our engine on. We went past them, and they decided to quit the race, put their engine on, and head for port. So this is what we do at sea. This is Ruthie washing her hair, and myself taking a shower with our salt water pump. And here we are with our main spinnaker set, just cruising down the coast of Mexico. And that the striped one behind me, you can see up forward the main spinnaker, and then the little mizzen spinnaker flying. So we've got everything set there. Now we arrive in Cabo San Lucas. And we spent several days there sort of relaxing, enjoying the sun, the scenery, the pelicans. And here is Santana at anchor in the harbor that interestingly doesn't exist anymore. They filled it in, and they have hotels down there. These are kids along the beach, pelicans following us, and Marty actually used to throw food up to them and feed them. There they are, probably waiting right around us. Now we head back to sea, and we're headed now for Acapulco, and here we watch the sun rising in the harbor at Acapulco. Enjoying a casual drink, Jim shelling oysters, and the scenery of Acapulco. Now we head south. We're headed for the Galapagos Islands. And this has us crossing the worst part of sailing, and that is the doldrums. We only carried, about 100 gallons of fuel that would have to last us for 3 or 4 months. And so we couldn't be running our engine. So we just sort of waited around the doldrums. Beautiful sunsets, unbelievable, calm, glassy waters, no wind. We used to just look for little rain squalls. We'd get little squalls. And finally, we make it to the Galapagos Islands. And here we are in Academy Bay, the Galapagos Islands, greeted by a friendly pelican. The Galapagos Islands, actually, if you run into a fisherman out in the world somewhere, they call it the Galapagos, but only fishermen know that. But we cruised around the island for quite a while, and one of our fun spots was Post Office Bay, where we gather around the post office. You leave a note for your name of your vessel, which we probably put on top, of course. And there's a slot there for you to put your mail. And what you do is you sort through the mail there and find mail headed for where you're headed. And so we left postcards for our friends, and it took, I think, 6 or 7 months before any one of them, our friends, ever received one. Okay, so now we travel around the islands a little bit, stopping in various places. We ran into a soldier who didn't speak English, and we didn't communicate very well, but he went off into the woods and told us to wait. and went off, chopped us a breadfruit, our first breadfruit for the trip. Then we were fortunate sailing around the islands and running into a schooner that, Marty, what was the name of that schooner?
Tyrone of Boston.
Tyrone of Boston, with a family on board and a young child, Lily, who we anchored next to them, and Lily came along with her little canoe, being followed by a young seal pup. And we stayed in this little bay with them for several days, played around with the seals and Lily and their crew, swimming and just having a good time, relaxing. But we went from there on to Wreck Bay, is known as, and the Angermeyer family lives there. And there's pictures of their houses and Carl Angermeyer, who actually ran a charter boat there. People could charter from him. He would take them for week tours around. But he's up feeding the iguanas some bread on his roof. And so the islands are very interesting. They got things like the Sally Lightfoot crab, and I'm ashore with my pipe and holding on some bone skeletons, probably from whales. But we then head off with Tyrone. We go to Tagus Bay, which is on the western coast of the Galapagos Islands. And from here, we said goodbye to them and headed on our first long sea voyage, 18 days to Pitcairn Island. And here we are, just on the verge of the trade winds. But as we headed out, in just a matter of a day or so, we started picking up the trades, sailing along. And the interesting thing about the trades is we thought the seas were a little too big. But you got to realize those trade winds have been blowing since creation. So naturally, the waves, even though the wind's about 18 to 20, the waves are 10 feet, 8 to 10 feet. So we sail along, and off in the distance, we finally see that famous island of Pitcairn. And within about 10 miles or so of the Pitcairn, two fellows came out from the harbor to greet us, because we were the first sailboat that year to come into the islands. And they have no regular trade routes or anything. It's just an amazing place. And Nordhoff and Hall's famous book on Pitcairn Island, Men Against the Sea and Mutiny on the Body. But they all took place here. And there's about 97 people that live on the island, and only 4 last names, because they're all descendants of the mutineers. So the Youngs, the Smiths, the
McCoys and Christians.
Christians and McCoys. So everybody has a different first name. No, there are no 2 Johns. And so it's an interesting place. We dropped our anchor in the bay there, which really isn't a bay. You're just sort of hanging off the side of the island. And we found out very quickly that it's not a good place to stay long, because we went ashore. We took turns going ashore, and we met the family, the Young family, and Purvis Young was the magistrate there. His wife's name is Pussy, believe it or not. That's before Pussy Galore. And so Purvis and Pussy, we spent the night at their house, and in the morning the wind has picked up, and we decided we better get back to the yacht. There's a graveyard there where the mutineers are buried. But the island is really spectacular. And in the morning, as we got up, we see the seas building up, the wind starting blowing, and way off in the distance, in one of these pictures, you can see the breaking water on the shore, but way off is a little dot, and that's Santana. So it was a rough afternoon. The wind really picked up, and Marty stayed ashore shooting some pictures of the island, and you could see the leaves and the trees blowing, the seas building up. And finally we went down to the bay where they launched their longboat and took Marty and Ruthie back out to the boat. It was a tough trip, and they came alongside, and we loaded them aboard and headed for Mangareva. Mangareva is a island in the Gambier group, and just to the north of Gambier Island is Maruru Atoll. And Maruru Atoll, at that time, the French were using for their atomic testing. And Gambier is only 50 miles from there. So anyway, we're headed there, and the word was that we were not going to be able to get in because the French had that area off as stay away. So anyway, we're at sea now, headed for Mangareva, and beautiful sunset. And I should comment at this time that we navigated with a sextant, an almanac, and a chronometer, and a set of tables. And we used the sun, the moon, the stars, about 40 different stars that we would navigate with and give us our exact position within about 1/10 of a mile when we computed it all. So we knew where we were. The only problem was at night you can't navigate because there's no horizon. You have to see what you're doing with your sextant is measuring the sun, the moon, the stars up from the horizon. And then by math and tables and various things, it gives you a line of position, and you cross two lines and that's where you are. So that's what we did. We didn't have GPS. This is 1971-72. Mr. Trumbull hadn't come up with this brilliant idea for a couple more years that allows us now to just press a button or look at a picture and know exactly where we are. So we were back doing the same kind of thing that the Columbus did. Now, Columbus didn't have it. He didn't have the chronometer, so he had to just use the noon sight for a latitude. But the chronometer came later on in the 1700s, and then people could get the longitude. Okay, so off we go, and we go enter the Mangareva, the Gambier group, and we noticed coming in, Jim went up and looked at the buoys, and the entrance buoys didn't match our charts. And it turns out that the French deliberately changed the buoys on the entrance. So if you tried to go in, you'd run up on a reef. But we were fortunate to have a couple of pearl divers, and their boat wave at us and came aboard, and the pearl divers then directed us into the main harbor of Mangareva, the Mangareva Harbor. The reason we went there was that I'd heard and read that Mangareva is one of the very rare islands where the coral blooms in the daytime. And I wanted to go there and see that. But we had a little problem. Looking around the islands and everything, you'll see in the pictures, in one picture, you'll see a big building off with a white roof. Well, the French built that as a fallout shelter because when the Maruru Atoll bomb goes off, all the people on this island have to go into that shelter because of the fallout. And the fallout that has landed in the harbor has killed all the coral. So we went all that way to see coral blooming, and there wasn't any. But we were fortunate while we were there because no one spoke English. It was a very, very primitive area, except for one man. His name was George Gooding, and he spoke perfect English, and he happened to live there with his family, and I don't know why or where or what, the background, but he was our guide and told us all the history of the island. And the island was absolutely beautiful. And we had our first coconut there. Marty's drinking the first coconut that we've had, and the coconut meat inside. It was wonderful. The most famous person probably that was ever there was back in the 1700s. His name was Father Pierre Laval, and he was a French priest, and he came there, and he decided to build a church. And it's the most magnificent church. It has a pearl altar that is shown in the pictures here. But he also, in doing it, he built a prison for all the men that worked there, because he felt they had to be imprisoned at night so they wouldn't have sex, which would weaken them. So he imprisoned them, and he was later went back to France, where they put him in prison for his activities. But the pearl altar inside the church is absolutely amazing. But Marty wanders around the island because we were where we weren't supposed to be. The police chief told me when we were anchored, came out and said, "You can't stay here." So I said, "Yes, I can. I have to, because I have to repair my vessel because we have a hole in the bottom and I can't go back to sea," which was actually true. We had off a pitcairn popped one of our planks, and we were taking in about 50 gallons of water an hour. And the whole trip, we had to keep pumping that water until we could haul out in Tahiti. Just one of those little problems that you have to face cruising. Anyway, we enjoyed our visit there and stocked up on fresh fruits and things that grew there and headed back off to sea. Now, we had a problem there because leaving Mangareva, we had to sail through an area filled with coral reefs. And so we had to zigzag through the coral reefs. And the hard part was we ran into a storm that lasted three days, and we couldn't get any sights. So we had to just sort of keep track of our heading and speed, and steer ourselves around these reefs. And Marty didn't trust us, so she slept at night in her tennis shoes, figuring that we were going to end up on a coral reef somewhere. But after 4 or 5 days, when we finally were able to get a sight, I was something like 15 miles off our dead reckoning that we figured on, that we kept track of all that time.
Which is good.
That was amazing. But we were then headed on to Tahiti. We were very, very low on water. We hadn't got any fresh water since we were in the Galapagos Islands. And our water tank was just about empty. And we ran into a rain squall. And then the rain squall, the rain comes down off the sails, and we had a bucket under the mast that caught the rain coming down. Well, Marty grabbed the bucket and filled our water tanks with it, but she didn't taste it first. And evidently the sail had a lot of salt in it, so our water then, our only water supply was salty. So we got into the harbor, and we had to anchor out. We couldn't tie up because we hadn't cleared customs. So we anchored out there, and God help us, it rained. And I went up there and caught rain and made a cup of coffee. I remember the best cup of coffee I've ever had. So we are in Tahiti, on the shore, meeting people, and there we finally hauled the boat out. And there we are hauled out. That gives you a good idea of what it looked like underneath. And that guy in the shorts working there, that's me. And Jim Leach was working, and we're replacing all the fastenings and everything and refastening the plank that had popped out. below the water line. And we give it a fresh coat of paint. And that's Santana now ready to go back into the water. And now it's sort of nice to have a freshwater shower too. But Tahiti was a beautiful, beautiful place. And my children, Georgie, and you were there too. Georgie, all three of you came to Tahiti. And we sailed around the islands and had a great time. And this is where I discovered Moorea with Georgie laughing in the background. But the scenes of, that's the harbor, in the main harbor in Moorea. And there we are, the whole family. Then we left there and sailed to Bora Bora. In this picture, Tommy Irvin, who joined, Tommy and Nancy joined us for the little trip from Tahiti, from Papeete to Bora Bora. And he took this picture of us sailing.
I'm washing dishes.
And that, you're washing?
I'm washing dishes in a bucket.
Oh, yeah, okay.
That's how I
But
did
that picture was our Christmas card that year. And here we are coming in, sailing into Bora Bora. And they're practicing there, the natives were practicing for the big fete, the 9th of July, I think it is, isn't it? And that they had their big fete and the dancers. And that night, I went back to the boat and came down with dengue fever and was very, very sick for a while. Then Marty got dengue too.
And you might mention dengue fever is like another form of malaria.
It's transferred by mosquitoes, but they call it breakbone fever because you lay in your bed and you feel like every bone in your body is broken. It's very, very painful.
It's lethal in a lot of cases, and people suffer permanent brain damage in some cases. Ours was a mild case, evidently, but it was very severe at the time.
So after we got well and feeling better, the kids all came and joined us, which is really, really wonderful that they could come down and spend some time with us. And there's a picture of us all on the stern of Santana, and off to the left is myself, followed by Callie, then Georgie, then Marty, then Charlie, all in their Santana t-shirts. But that was really a fun visit for them, an experience of what it's like, sailing. And then they joined us later on for Christmas in Australia, in Sydney. So anyway, from here we head now south to the Cook Islands. The Cook Islands, one of the major stopping points for the yacht, and I want to say Wanderer, but that wasn't the name of that yacht that traveled around the world with students all the time. And there's a picture of Marty with the Wanderer up on a reef where it died, were their voyages. But the Cook Islands were sort of neat. They're beautiful. We traveled around them on a motorbike. And actually we took some horses out, and the horses actually went out in the ocean and drank the salt water, believe it or not. We traveled through the South Pacific now, and I'm going to just let you enjoy some of the scenes that we've had on different islands and some of our traveling around the islands. The important thing really is that where there were no big hotels, there was no tourism or cruise ships. These are just the native people on the islands as you see them, and whether it's Tonga or Samoa or Suva or whatever, they all are bit the same, and the same sort of things. The natives are very primitive. The missionaries have taught them to sing some religious songs, but of all the things they are, is they're friendly, the most friendly, nice people you'll ever meet. and they just loved having visitors come, and they would they did think there was a stop we made in Tonga, I believe, that Marty had met this lady Maddie, and she gathered up little reeds from palm trees and made a basket for her. And interesting thing was, you'll see a picture of her little son, and instead of a pillow, he had a wooden block that he slept on. I mean, that was his pillow, a wooden block. But things are very different than probably now, where there's more tourism and so forth. While in the Fiji Islands, my old urge to make money took over, and a couple of fortunate things had happened. One, the Fijian government had done aerial surveys of all of the islands, which allowed us to look down and see where coral heads were and so forth in the pictures. And I found an island on the very eastern end of Fiji called Gamea that had a little bay in it, and on that bay there was a piece of freehold land because it was a copra plantation once owned by an American, or an Englishman, excuse me, by the name of Mitchell. And he had some descendants from his native wife, and they lived there, and they wanted to sell that property. So we sailed in to there and we were going to spend just a few days, but I think we spent almost 2 weeks there, and in the process negotiated with the family there. And there's some beautiful pictures here of Santana in the anchorage of where the property is, and pictures of the property. And at the same time, our crew, because we were in there for a period of time, decided to get to work and redo the varnish on the rails, and they all fit in while I was sort of ashore trying to negotiate with the Mitchells on 3 separate pieces of property, which we ended up purchasing. And these pictures there's one picture with 3 huts and Marty standing there. That is now an internationally famous dive resort. And there's a picture there of the Mitchell family with Marty standing with Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell and their 2 children. But it was really a great visit there, and it was a jumping point off for us. It took me a year actually to negotiate with all the lawyers to end up with the property. We ended up with about 200 acres there. But from here, we headed south to New Zealand, Auckland. And the weather was nice and pleasant, but not for long. Halfway down to the islands, and I'm going to have a map in here that you'll see how our route was, and you can see in the northern part the islands and a straight south line going down to New Zealand. And halfway down there, we got hit by a typhoon, which in the northern hemisphere is called a hurricane, which is also well known as a tropical cyclone. And the weather started deteriorating on us, and the clouds started to come, and the clouds tell you something. If they're wispy clouds, they're called mare's tails, and that predicts a storm coming. And the length of the mare's tails and the height of them tell you a little bit about how bad the storm's going to be. Well, those clouds just kept moving in on us, and by nightfall, the winds were picking up. And there's an interesting thing that happens with winds that people don't realize. That once the winds go over 70 miles an hour, they actually knock the waves down. So the winds at 60 miles an hour are about the highest waves you're going to get. Because once it gets to 70 and 80, the wind blows them flat. The barometer dropped on us to the lowest we'd ever seen it. It just instantly dropped, and that was just about exactly midnight. I'm including a copy of our barograph, which shows when we left Suva, going on down. It shows how the barometer dropped when we hit the hurricane or typhoon, and then how it gradually rises, and the very end of it is up high where we arrive in Auckland. And we had an anemometer, wind speed, that showed us we were up to 95 knots, 105 miles an hour. And at that point, we were all down below, and we had just the little mizzen sail up and a little storm jib. That's it. And the boat would be hove to in a storm situation. It would lay in that position. The sails would just keep it steady, and we wouldn't really be moving. But it just sort of, once we set those sails, no matter what was happening, the boat sort of calmed down, and you sort of rode up and down on the wave. Right about midnight, Jim peeked out back and said, the mizzen's gone. I said, the sail's gone? He said, no, the whole thing, mast and everything. And that was true. And as soon as the wind started to calm down and the seas started to build up, that mast was held by all of the lines, the shrouds that were holding it, and it started ramming us. And the big waves, we realized that thing was going to go through our single plank hull pretty quickly. So immediately we went on deck and started to work, bringing the mast, boom, and of course the sail was on it, so it was a hard job to bring that in the heavy seas and the wind blowing, and we had to bring that rig in. It was a night to remember, and in about 2 hours we had the sail off the mast, we had the mast and the boom lashed down on deck, and being a super tightwad, which I am, I wanted to save the mast because it had all kinds of fittings on it that I would need if I wanted to build another one, which I had to do. So we stayed hove to until the seas and the wind calmed down, which took a couple of days. And in the meantime, in the evening, I was able on the VHF radio to reach the emergency station in Auckland. And they kindly said if they would keep us on call every night, and if they didn't hear from us, they were going to send planes out to find us, which was really amazing because we were an American vessel, not a New Zealand vessel, but we were at sea, and that was their job. We survived it and continued on down into Auckland, and about 2 days before Auckland, I developed a staph infection in my hands from all the holes in my hands from handling the wire rigs and everything else that night. I punctured my hands with little teeny pinpricks, and I got a staph infection. But we carried a medical kit that was phenomenal, and the doctor told us instead of taking 4 a day, take 12. If it doesn't work, start on something else. Well, I started on the antibiotics, and by the time I got to Auckland, I was well. Just in 2 or 3 days, it cured me. But we pulled into Auckland then, and we're glad to be there, but now we had to build a new mast. Our arrival in Auckland was a real surprise to me because we pulled in, they directed us into a slip, and right next to us was the most famous, probably, cruising couple in the world. A man who has written 3 books and 3 times has sailed around the world with his wife, Eric and Susan Hiscock. And it was their books when I was young, 10 years before we left. His first book and second book that just turned me on to sailing around the world. He was responsible for it. And he looked at our boat, and there's a picture of us side by side, and our mizzen is on deck. So he was very curious as to how we handled that. But they were a wonderful couple, very nice next door neighbors. And we went then looking for uh, a yard where we could build a new mast. And we happened to be there for the 2 week period in Auckland where the whole country goes on vacation simultaneously. Everything closes. You better have stocked up on food. So I went to the yard, and the yard manager or owner was very nice, and he said, "All right, we happen to have a small supply of Sitka spruce, was what I needed to make the mast with. And there's a fellow that retired about, I don't know, 10 years ago, who was a spar builder. And they said, we'll get a hold of him, and you and he can go up to our loft and work and build that mast," which we did. And I went there every day, and we started working and building our new mast with our old mast laying beside it, and to compare it. And there's pictures of the gentleman working and sanding, and myself comparing the step from the old one.
And how long did it take?
And I think it took us about 2 weeks, to build a mast. And all that time, by then, when we were finished, they were just about ready to open the yard. By the way, our crew member, Max Frichot, was from the Seychelles Islands, and for some reason, and I don't know how, every port we pulled into, there was a Pan Am waitress who were just waiting for him. And he was remarkable. Anyway, so we grabbed the new mast, put it in the back of a pickup truck, and drove down to the dock and walked down the dock with it and put it in its hole. And there it is with all the pieces that we saved, the winches, the handles, everything. There's a little handiwork by Jim Leach using his macrame knowledge of giving us a little trim. But there's the new mast looking just as good as ever. So, and there's our antenna back up. So now we're in New Zealand and the land of the Kiwi. And we had a wonderful time there. We went and toured. We took an airplane down to the South Island, went to Mount Cook, toured around. It was just beautiful. And we went fishing, trout fishing. There's pictures of Mount Cook. And there was a rainforest underneath.
There was a
below.
maiden in the woods.
A beautiful maiden
Yeah,
in the woods.
and an unbelievable rainforest in there with giant ferns. And of course, driving the highways there, we had a car that we rented, and you have a traffic jam periodically by the sheep, and you'll have to wait maybe half an hour as a herd of sheep go by. But and again, the New Zealanders could not have been nicer to us. The one guy came down and said, "You've got to have a TV," and he brought a TV down to the boat and put it in the aft cabin for Marty and I watch TV at night.
Well, we got invited to christenings of their godchildren, and
Yeah.
they were very hospitable people. And
So
the
this-
geography and the topography in New Zealand was like none other. Unbelievably beautiful.
And they love foreigners because at that time they were restricted on currency that they could take out of the country. So they really couldn't travel out of the country for very long because the currency was so limited in what they could take.
We went up into the Lake District and visited various resorts and farms, and this little girl had her own lamb. And when I picked the lamb up, I couldn't believe it. It was like a feather. I mean, it was like a huge dog in size, but it was so light. And I was a fishing fool there. I love fish, so I fished a lot up in the lake country. And when you went back to your hotel or motel there, they automatically prepared it for you for dinner or smoked it so I could take it back to the boat.
And around your neck you wore a figa, a good luck charm.
From Fiji.
But New Zealand really is an amazing country. It's beautiful, beautiful country. And the people, the countryside, everybody, just marvelous. And the fishing we did for trout, inland trout, was on Lake Taupo. But you can just enjoy the,
There's no way you can capture the beauty of those.
yeah. Now, we left New Zealand, and sailed across the terrible Tasman to Sydney.
Rushcutters Bay.
And this is Sydney. And the trip across was interesting in that we're so far south, we're out of the trade winds, and we're in what I call the weather zone, because the storms and fronts and what have you go through there, and the wind can come from all directions. And halfway across, we were in a big storm after we left Auckland, and the weather got bad and so forth, and big seas, and then all of a sudden we went through the front. It was just, all of a sudden the rain stopped, clouds cleared, and the wind changed from a favorable direction, and we'd had all our sails reefed down to nothing. And so I made one of the giant mistakes, and that was I let the reef go, and we raised the main full, we put a full jib up, and we started sailing, but the waves were still coming, big waves from the other direction. And Santana would go up on one and crash down on the other, because the waves were coming from the wrong direction. Later on, when we arrived in San Francisco, the boat was surveyed, and they found 26 broken ribs, and I know exactly when they happened, in the terrible Tasman Sea. So, off we are to Australia, where we're going to spend Christmas and have our kids join us for the holidays, courtesy of my mother, who also joined us. Well, shortly after our arrival in Sydney, which was a wonderful stop, we stayed at the yacht club there, and weathers came in. Weathers are unique to that area. They called it a knock 'em down, knock me down or something. And these black clouds roll in, and they're boiling. They're just churning, 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 and the winds are horrendous, and the weather temperature drops, and it gets dark in the middle of the day. And there's some pictures here that you can enjoy not being there. But Sydney was a great place for us to really take a break. Mother brought my 3 children down, Georgie and Charlie and Callie down. But the harbor there is just beautiful, beautiful. And there's some shots of Sydney, and we went across on a ferry boat over to where they had a little zoo where we saw our first koala bear and kangaroos. And then when Charlie came down, we had arranged for us to fly out to a station, which to the rest of us is a ranch, but to Australia, that's a station. And they had
Baby Joey.
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 Joey, a little kangaroo, and Charlie is holding it here. I put it in my shirt, which was the dumbest thing I've ever did, because the thing was full of fleas, and I suffered all the way home.
But they automatically go into hiding. I mean, he just was holding the little Joey.
They thought that was a pouch. That was Mother's pouch.
Yeah.
This is a warthog, no, just a pig.
Boar.
Boar. So we got to be friendly while we were there with C.B. Brunzell, who was the plywood king of South Africa, and his yacht Stormy. And that was his small boat. His major sailboat was Stormvogel, very well known old racing schooner, I believe. But leaving Sydney and going up the coast of Australia, we played games with Stormy.
I want to say here that for interest's sake, when Charlie and I pulled into a port where we were going to be for any length of time, we would buy an old used car for the duration that we were going to spend there so that we could tour around. We did that in Australia, we did it in New Zealand, we did it when we got to South Africa. And people often wonder, did you live on the boat the whole time? Well, the truth of the matter is that we did do a lot of touring and getting out to know the culture and the people when we were there for any length of time. We were actually in the Sydney Harbour for 2 months, I think, because we had to wait for certain weather patterns to pass. So we got to be very familiar with a lot of the Australians.
Well, one of our major delays was that I happened to have a disease known as Dupuytren's contraction, which causes my fingers to curl up into knuckles. And both my hands, by the time we got there, had curled up into knuckles. And I needed to have the Dupuytren's released so that I could open one hand flat. And so I was in the hospital there and had an operation, and they straightened my hand out, but it took me a while to recover. So we waited, and then we headed up the Barrier Reef, and we stopped on one island, and there was a game warden there, and a little resort where the owners were there. There were no tourists at the resort, sort of off season, I guess. And there was a herd of goats, mountain goats, or no, just wild goats there. And I really wanted to go hunt a goat and have a goat party. And Stormy's crew was there, and so I asked the game warden. He said, "I'm here to keep people from shooting them." I said, "Oh, darn it." He said, "Well, the best place to go is right around the corner over here on the end of that island.
Where I can't see you.
And I probably won't be there for another week anyway." So he told me exactly where to go to get the sheep. That he was there to keep people from getting. But anyway, this is Australia. So we did. I went up and with my little .38 revolver and went after a goat. And got one. And Max
Cleaned it.
And cooked it. And we had a party with the two crews on the shore of one of the islands offshore there. And there we are roasting our goat.
We had Billy Bong tea and all kind, because one of the girls on the other boat, because we cruised in tandem with Stormy, and one of the girls on board, I remember her name was Adele, she was Australian, so she cooked Billy Bong tea and made biscuits in the Australian outback way. It was very exciting, kind of living off the land, so to speak, for a while.
I've got to tell you, Max was a rather unique fellow. He was born in the Seychelles Islands and came from a very prestigious family. I think his father was governor. But he was just sort of a rebel, and I think he had 4 or 5 brothers and sisters. But he was hitchhiking around the world when we found him in Tahiti, and he was a wonderful crew member for us. But we had one head on the boat, one toilet. And in the year that Max was with us, he never used it. In the morning, you'd see him perched like a seagull on the back rail. And later in the day, he was facing back. But he never in a year managed to go to that.
Okay.
So, and there is a picture of him in his full dress Speedo. And
Cleaning
we got crabs. This is the Stormy crew with Max, I think. This is on the islands. I can't tell you which one it was, but this is a monument to Captain Cook, who was there, and he was there in May 1770. This is an interesting thing. We had a albatross
Perched on the pulpit.
perched on the pulpit, and just below him and aft about 6 or 7 feet was a female there. And he sat there all night. She stood out there all night, and the female died. And
How did you
It
know?
was-
How did you know which was the female?
Marty went up there. How did they know it was a male?
Or female?
I don't know.
Bill would have left.
Yeah, really.
But in the morning, Marty went up there and had to break the news to him that his partner for life had died. Now, we did some fishing and en route and caught a few mahi-mahis.
Max and I were very fond of fish, and Max was an expert fisherman. So when he brought in these dolphin, he'd clean them lickety-split. I mean, I've just never seen anyone work quite that fast and accurately with a knife. Scale it and clean it, and then I always had a supply of limes on board. And he and I would sliver the fresh meat off and just squeeze lime juice over it and just savor every inch of that fresh flesh.
So we went on up the coast of Australia, up to New Guinea, and then we got into Port Moresby, and welcomed by a rainbow. Now, Port Moresby was an interesting place because World War II, the Japanese never quite got to Port Moresby. There was a trail that a very rugged trail that the soldiers would have to take from the northern part of New Guinea down, called the Kokoda Trail, and
It was
they
definitely.
were never able to successfully come into that harbor. In that harbor were some ships that were sunk during the war. And the interesting thing to me was that salt water preserves wood. And there was a ship there that you can see where the high tide is and low tide, because those planks, those deck planks, are in good shape up to the point where the high tide ends. Now, our crew members decided that they were going to take a hike and do the Kokoda Trail. And what they did was they made arrangements with, I'm not quite sure, there was a pilot that agreed to pick them up about 3 or 4 days later back in the inlands of New Guinea. There was a strip that he could pick them up. But they left hiking, and they go from village to village. Each village, they'd get a new guide that would take them to the next village and so forth. And at the end of it, they said they should have never done it. It was horrible, horrible, horrible trip, but they did it.
Those are the symbols of the Kokoda Trail.
Yeah. Here they are preparing to go off on the trail. Now, outside of Port Moresby, there's a hill. And on this hill, the natives, there's, 300 different languages spoken in New Guinea? Or the different tribes all have a different language? It's just amazing. But these people come down to this hill, and they have a trading market. And it's called, for good reason, Excreta Hill. You can take it from there. But the hill, you can smell the hill a mile away. Anyway, So these are pictures of the natives trading on Excreta Hill. This is a picture now. There's pictures of the boys on the Kokoda Trail going along, what it was like for them going back into the jungle.
Now
Then-
we're flying.
Then, well, after they did that and came home, Marty and I decided to take a trip to the Trobriand Islands, which are a unique, primitive culture that is totally undisturbed and like it was 2,000 years ago.
Made famous, were made pretty well known by Margaret Mead, who did studies. Some of her archaeological studies and philanthropic studies had to do with the Trobriand Island people and their generational mating and breeding habits. But that sounds crude in the telling, but that's what she was studying there.
Now, one of the things that I've sort of collected as we traveled were carvings. And I found the most primitive people make the most delicate, beautiful carvings. And they come from the soul. And I was able to shop around with these fellows. They were very anxious to sell their carvings for money, because money was almost unheard of on these islands. And I negotiate with them and look over. I don't really dicker with them, because whatever the price is, and if I want it, I buy it. And the people there were very, very friendly, but all I can say is they're just very primitive. And the island itself was a beautiful place. We went to some of the little villages. We traveled around a little bit, and they put on little shows for us. I think we had maybe 8 or 10 on our flight. I think that the group that we had.
Yeah, these were native cultural dances.
But this was really just a wonderful trip. As I say, they're primitive. And now the one thing you have to sort of watch for, they had these houses that they stored food in.
Up on stilts, of course.
And here's the man carving a dugout canoe.
And you were amazed at how short the people were, remember?
Yeah.
Really?
I'm bending over. Now, you'll see some natives, some of them were painted black, and you will see a child that's painted black, but in the background here is a lady painted black, and that means they're in mourning. And they'll stay painted black for, I forget, it's a month, a moon, or something like that. This is a picture of a man with his pet bird. And here we have a young man in mourning and young lady in mourning. And Marty.
You can see how hot and humid it was. I can remember
You're-
when we were there, we were dripping constantly.
You're just totally wet with your shirt.
Yeah. Look at that darling little canoe.
Oops, loading. But we traveled by boat around the island a little bit, and here were some young kids, and they were on a branch sticking out, and I remember clearly they were singing Inky Dinky Parlez-vous.
We were actually going upriver in one of these dugouts.
Yeah.
Unbelievably beautiful. And again, primitive, and you couldn't believe you were there in that world at the time.
So now we're back at sea, and so we leave the Trobriand Islands and we go back to Port Moresby. Beautiful little scenes here. And we meet Stormy, our friends again. And we take an afternoon and sail over to a little island beach where we have a little swim and relax. Then we said goodbye to them, but we were both headed now for Darwin. And to go from Port Moresby to Darwin, you go through Torres Straits, which Cook, because I think he was, I don't know, relaxing or something, he named the islands Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And Thursday Island is sort of a famous place because they have a restaurant there, and the anchorage, you have to walk for, I'd say about a quarter of a mile through the jungle to get there. And the natives there, and what happens is that the mothers want their daughters to be
Mated
more,
with a white person.
well, have children that are a little more intelligent or something like that. Anyway, I digress. However, as we walk through the woods, going toward the restaurant, you hear this toot, 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 little peeping, and the mothers are in the bushes, and they're trying to kidnap a man and have the daughter impregnated. And it's the only place in the world where men get raped. So
Sort of.
anyway,
Sort of.
I think Max
A lot of it is
Max didn't want to leave.
A lot of it is legendary, of course, but Max said that it was true. Max did have an
Well,
experience.
Max would know. So anyway, we sailing through, and Stormy took some pictures of us, and we took some pictures of them going along the Torres Straits here. There's a picture of us from Stormy. That's what we look like sailing along. And here we are with Max at the helm, and I'm standing on the boom here.
Always ahead of them.
And
so fast.
what happened was I didn't have a detailed chart of Darwin entrance, and they had a duplicate. So we traded that night, and they passed it to us. And there's a scene of us close together here with our rod going over to grab the chart, and then on we go. So we had a tradition. There's a tradition at sea. When you pass a military vessel, you dip the flag, and then they dip their flag back at you, sort of indicating that we're friendly. So this aircraft carrier went by us, and I reached back and grabbed our flagpole and dipped it. And sure enough, they raised their flag up the pole and dipped it back. Giant aircraft carrier. So this is now we've arrived in Darwin, and if you've never seen a dingo, this is a dingo. The native dog.
You should talk about the tides there in Darwin.
And this is David going in for the magnetic anthills. Those anthills are very thin. I'm not sure this. Yeah, there we are. And they face north and south, so that the sun will keep them warm or something. And Marty went over there, stood by it, and regretted it because the ants crawl all over her.
They were actually termites, Charlie, weren't they?
That's right, they were
Yeah,
termites.
I want to say something here. When we were in Rushcutters Bay in Sydney, we picked up an extra crew member. Jim was still sailing with us, and Max was still sailing with us, but we needed a fifth because I was wrung out at this
David
point.
Dannon.
So we picked up a young American who had been sailing on another boat, and he got off that boat and came aboard our boat. And he was a navigator, a very hip young guy from California. And he went all the way to Africa with us. So the fellow that you now see on board that's kind of new is David Dannon.
And as we realized after going through the cyclone, that 4 of us were shorthanded. And it was just not a safe situation. And we felt that we needed a 5th crew member. And also that took Marty off 12 hours of watch. And she then was cooking and was reserved for anybody that needed to.
Because prior to that, the first half of our trip, I had been doing 12 hours of watch and all the cooking and shopping. So I was drained and I was unhappy.
Our arrival after Darwin was Bali after a very hair-raising trip, which I'll tell you about in a minute. But the seas, as you can see, are calm and nice, and it was a good time for all the boys to get to work and revarnish and fix the boat up. So you'll see everybody working here except Max, who was a supervisor. I'll backtrack now. On the way to Bali from Darwin, we were intercepted by pirates. We'd been warned about this by the FBI before we even left San Francisco, that this was a bad area for pirates. And sure enough, in the early evening, we had a vessel that we could see just off the horizon coming after us. And as the sun set and it got dark, we could see the vessel was moving in towards us. Now, fortunately, there was no moon at that time. It was pitch black. So they had their running lights on and we had ours off. And we just kept that boat to our stern. As it altered course, we altered course. And during that time, we brought out all the arms we had down below, and all the crew were carrying a gun of one sort or another. But we fortunately were able to sail over the horizon, and the curvature of the earth blocked them from seeing us or us seeing them. And they must have given up the search because we turned and headed up to New Guinea, which was a great, beautiful, New Guinea, into Bali. And it was a beautiful, beautiful area. We went all around the island, visiting things and seeing old temples and just relaxing and having a good time, because from there we were going to be crossing the Indian Ocean, and this was a good time to relax and stock up on food, and very, very enjoyable visit. The area back in the interior of Bali is interesting, and I'd heard about a village in the way up in the mountains where they buried the dead in the trees. And the reason for that was they felt the birds take their body and soul up to heaven. And so we went up there, and this is a picture looking down on that village, and you can see a tree, and I didn't want to get close enough for morbid reasons to show bodies in the trees, but they were there.
One of the things that I'd like to say about our visit to Bali is that in retrospect, it was one of the most unique and beautiful places we visited. There were several, of course, that were exciting, but the fields, the way they were groomed and set in rows and circular patterns, and the outfits on the women, all of it denoted beauty and serenity. The buildings, the churches, what are they called? I forget. The temples and the rituals and the music and the dancing and everything about Bali was graceful and beautiful. And it'll be displayed in some of these pictures as they go along. you can see the style and the beauty throughout, and it was very unique.
So we left Darwin and headed off into the Indian Ocean, where we wanted to stop at Christmas Island. But as we went by, there was a storm brewing, and there was no safe anchorage. So we sailed by Christmas Island and headed for Keeling Cocos Island. Keeling Cocos was actually a spot where Max Frichot had lived for a while. And the little native sailing boats there are called dugongs. And Max's dugong was still there. So we took turns out sailing Max's dugong around the little harbor. It's an interesting island. It's sort of part of Australia, but it's a kingdom. And and I forget the name of the man, I should remember, but the fellow that is the owner, essentially. And the thing about Keeling Cocos Island has a giant airport, and it's an emergency base for flights crossing the Indian Ocean. And now that we're in a jet era, that's virtually unused. But in the old days of props and military planes and so forth. And you wonder how many people it takes to man an airport. Well, it was interesting because they had schools for the children, this, that, and the other people, couples, so forth. And as I recall, it was 37 people it takes to run an airport, minimum. But it was a beautiful little stop. It's a very protected, circular series of islands that block the seas, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful place. So we stayed there for a while, had a good time, and then we left Cocos, headed for Mauritius. So with dawn, we leave the Cocos Islands and sail off for Mauritius. And behind us, we turn and look, and we see Stormy, our partner for months, leaving us. They're headed in a different direction, and we had southeast for Mauritius. The arrival of Mauritius was interesting. We pulled into the main port there, Port Louis, and tied up along the commercial dock, which was right on the main street in town. Now, Mauritius at that time was sort of a free zone for marijuana. And it was interesting. I could sit up on deck there, and I would watch the policeman go off duty and light up a joint. Unbelievable. But there was no law against it, and it was common, and I just asked the crew one thing. If you're going to smoke a joint, go ahead, but don't do it on board Santana, please. You know, go ashore and enjoy yourself. But Mauritius is an interesting island. It was settled primarily by the French. I guess that's where the word Mauritius is French, I guess. And there are these sugar plantations around the island with a big fancy mansion house and still operating and still, producing sugar, which unfortunately the price of sugar right now is very low, so that they're not very successful at the moment. But we ran around the island and beautiful beaches and mountains, and up on the north end of the island was the yacht club, which was a beautiful place to come in, but we couldn't make it in there because we drew 9 feet, and I think the channel was only 6 feet deep, so it wasn't worth the effort to try and plow our way in there. But we enjoyed it very much. It was a very, very interesting visit, and there'll be more about what happened in Mauritius later on when we get to Durban, and I'll tell you about that when we get there. But just enjoy the scenery, and we headed out from there towards Africa.
Our last few nights in Mauritius, we spent at a glorious little hotel on the other side of the island. And it was not only romantic, but peaceful and a whole nother world from that which I had done for the last year and a half. And I can remember standing on the beach the last night in Mauritius thinking, I can't do this for a whole nother year. And we had a whole nother year ahead of us. And I got on the ship I got on Santana very reluctantly. But then once we got to Africa, I just couldn't quit.
The sail now from Mauritius to Durban, South Africa, was a tough one. We ran into a very bad storm a couple days off, a couple of 100 miles off Madagascar, and we didn't stop there. We went under Madagascar and then on to the safe harbor, Durban, where we had to say goodbye to our wonderful, wonderful crew member, Max Frichot, who had been with us for a year, and his family lived in, his brother actually lived in Durban and was a lawyer, and convinced Max it was time to quit sailing and go home. So we said goodbye to him, and then we sort of shared time with the crew. Some on board, they'd stay on board, and we'd go visit the animals in the woods and plains of Africa. One of the first ones we met was George, a giraffe who we heard about was 150 miles out of the town and in a little reserve area, and I went up there to meet George, and George was very friendly and greeted me, and the world's friendliest wild giraffe. But we went on around and visited animals, and were joined by my cousin, Elizabeth Slade Driscoll, and her husband, John Driscoll, who had been writing me during the time and wanted to know when he could join us for a part of the trip. And I said, okay, join us in Durban, and we'll go sightseeing and maybe do some hunting, and then we'll sail around to Cape Town. So we did that, and one of the things that Marty arranged was she wrote the commissioner of mines, and the government then got a hold of us and invited us at their expense to go to Johannesburg, where we would be in a private DC-3 flown to a gold mine in central Africa, where we were met by the president of the mining company, taken to lunch there, the four of us, the Driscolls and the Peets, and we went down into the bowels of the earth where they're mining the gold. And it was very interesting. We watched the whole process, and then we came up, and we watched them pour a gold ingot. And you'll see in the pictures here the gold ingot, and they let it cool, and I pick it up to feel the weight of it. And there was a lot of money in there. Africa is known for its wildlife and primitive civilization. So with the Driscolls, we took off in a car and started driving. We probably drove 600-700 miles around Africa, visiting little communities. But our primary thing was to see the wildlife. And I managed to take quite a few slides of different animals as we traveled around. And I'm just going to let you relax and look at a few pictures here and enjoy some of the wildlife. I would like to add a comment. Some of these animals, they're wild. They're not necessarily tame, particularly the rhinos. And I was with a guide when I took the pictures of the couple of rhinos, and the male and a female. And the male all of a sudden decided that they didn't like me, and he stepped down and he put it in low gear and charged me. At which point the guide that was with me turned and charged the rhino, yelling, The rhino hit the brakes, the dust flew, and he turned around and went back. And I'll tell you, it takes guts to charge a rhino.
One of the things I'd like to say about visiting South Africa is that we spent 3 months there, and in those 3 months, we got to visit Zulu tribes, and we went on safari at some private little reserves and things. And in that milieu, we were able to really be on a one-to-one basis with many of the Zulu people. And I'm here to tell you, they are fabulously beautiful, eager to please people. And when I say eager to please, we found in visiting many of these cultures, but especially amongst the Zulu people, they were so eager to be with another faction and culture themselves that they would do anything to spend time with you on a personal basis and get to know their territory basis.
Okay, that's right, Marty. And if you'll also remember that when we went into these primitive places, we were Americans, and Americans at that time to these people were almost godlike people because we had been to the moon. And the moon is a symbol in many of these primitive cultures, a relationship with God and so forth. But the fact that we had actually been to the moon was just a phenomenal thing. We stayed in Durban for almost 3 months because we had to wait for the weather around the Horn to subside because it was winter down there and the storms are vicious. So as soon as we got a little word of clear weather, we headed off with the Driscolls, John and Elizabeth, to sail around the Cape. So we did. We continued and went around the Cape with them,
Cape Horn,
Elizabeth and John. And finally, we arrived at the southern end of Africa, and amazingly enough, it was a dead calm. It was an overcast, dead calm day, and we just turned the engine on and powered on through this area that's known just for horrific weather. I think somebody overhead was watching us and gave us the green light and told us, head for Cape Town, which we did. And upon entering Cape Town, we immediately headed into the yacht club there, tied up, and we were tied up, as I recall, around 10 o'clock in the morning. We tied up there, and by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it was blowing 70 miles an hour in the harbor there. So the storms come up rapidly. We actually drove out to see the Cape, and there's some pictures of us at the Cape, and our stay in Cape Town was really fairly short because we were just going to head from there across the South Atlantic. And the South Atlantic is a wonderful ocean in that it has never had a typhoon, a cyclone, or a hurricane in history. The only ocean that hasn't. And the reason is that the western hump of Africa sticks out and the eastern hump of South America sticks out, and they almost overlap a little bit enough so that the storms aren't created. So our first stop across the South Atlantic was the island of St. Helena, where I believe Napoleon died. He was sent there in exile. And the town is interesting. It's buried between two mountains, and looking out to the sea where we were anchored. And off to the left of this picture is a staircase that goes up to the top of the mountain. And we all know that staircase by its name, Jacob's Ladder. We are climbing Jacob's Ladder.
That's where that is. Huh?
So we just toured around the island a little bit, Marty going for a walk, up the hillside. Out in the bay you can see the local fishermen have brought in a bunch of tuna. And it was just a nice visit, interesting island. And then we headed off from there, heading northbound, and the next island was Ascension Island, which is, in contrast, it's really just a, a beachy, low-level island, not with the big mountains, but more hills, and a big military base there. It's also known because it's the crossing point of all the telephone cables that go from North and South America to Africa and Europe, and it's well guarded because bombing that island could break up the communications virtually from the world. There's a shot of me standing next to a road going along that's cut on Ascension through a lava flow. Interesting shot. And the next is a picture of us with some of the military personnel that befriended us while we were there, saying goodbye to us as we turn and now head north for the longest trip we will take, 22 days at sea, from Ascension Island to Barbados in the Caribbean. You know, the remarkable thing to me is to lean over the transom of the vessel where you're cruising along and see the little activity back there behind you, the bubbles, and think to yourself, you know, we are traveling totally free. We're not using any fuel, gas. We're moving by nature's force, the wind. And we're just totally dependent on the wind for how we set our sails and so forth. But from the South Atlantic, the wind was it was the most beautiful, beautiful trip that we had. I often said that cruising is 10% wonderful, 80% just getting there, and the last 10% is just horrible. But this trip in the South Atlantic was part of the top 10% enjoyable trip. And I remember we set this spinnaker, we had it flying and didn't touch it for 7 straight days. So here we have arrived after 22 days in Bequia, and we will have visitors join us, and we will sail around the Caribbean a little bit and enjoy and relax ourselves and do some sightseeing. And I'm just not going to just pinpoint people out, but you can just see we're having a good time. And the next thing we do from there, from the Caribbean, after spending, actually, we went, Marty and I took a week off and we went up to Florida and had Christmas with my mother in Florida. Then we returned to the boat and then sailed to Panama. So we arrive in Panama, and you can see ahead the entrance to the Panama Canal, which we entered, and they put a captain, port captain aboard your vessel, who's theoretically in charge, and he didn't quite understand sailboats. He was used to going on big freighters or anything. So he let us pretty well run the boat, and he would tell us when to stop and when to tie up. But we went on through the Panama Canal, which, interestingly enough, is sort of a history back in my family, because when Teddy Roosevelt took over the rebuilding of the canal from the French, they gave up because of the disease and so forth. They needed a good engineer to redesign what the French had planned that didn't work. That one that could develop the Miraflores and the San Isidro locks, which carry you up into the lake and across the lake and down the other side. So when you go through the canal, you're actually raised up about 30 feet to go across a lake and then lower down the other side. and there's enough water flowing into that lake constantly to keep the lake at the right level. But Roosevelt needed a good engineer, and he turned to, actually, he's sort of his enemy, but he respected him. My great grandfather, James J. Hill, who had one of the world's best engineers uh, on his staff, and he loaned him to Roosevelt, and he went on. His name is Stevens, and there's on the railroad. There's Stevens Pass going through Glacier Park, and Mr. Stevens redesigned the canal, and they completed it, and to his credit. And then he returned to the Great Northern Railroad afterward. So from Panama, we headed north, and our next stop was going to be Acapulco, which would be our official crossing because we left from there and headed to the Galapagos. So at that point, when we arrive in Acapulco, we will have officially sailed around the world. Now, going up the coast, it was fairly light winds, and we used the engine a little more than usual. So at one point, we ran into the Promiso, I believe it was, a fishing vessel, and we asked them if they would sell us some fuel, which they agreed to. We passed back and forth some cans, and they gave us, as I recall, about 30 gallons of fuel, and they gave us 2 buckets of shrimp that they'd been catching, and they charged us 4 Playboy magazines.
That's funny.
Anyway, from then on, we went on into Acapulco, and again relaxed for a few days. Marty and I took a drive up into the village, some of the little villages around, and generally relaxed and prepared for our trip north to Cabo San Lucas. So Cabo San Lucas was our last real stop before we head north to California, and Marty decided that she'd sailed around the world and that was enough. So she left us at that point and flew back to San Francisco, which was really wonderful because when we arrived in San Francisco, I had my son Charlie with me. He'd joined us in San Diego and sailed on up, and that was wonderful to go under the Golden Gate Bridge, and Marty and Callie were in a powerboat meeting us there and taking some pictures of us as we entered the harbor. But looking back, as we came under the Golden Gate Bridge, my son turned to me and he said, "Dad, what are you thinking about?" And I thought for a second. I said, I wish God would have told me we were going to make it because I wouldn't have worried so much. But on we went into the St. Francis Yacht Club, celebrating with champagne and so forth. 37,000 miles at an average speed of 6 miles an hour.
How many days?
And it took us, we were gone 2.25 years. And we also made 87 stops in our trips around the world. And, a lifetime experience, a lucky one. And we were fortunate to be able to do it before GPS, no autopilots. We actually sailed the entire route, someone at the helm. And, another interesting fact is people often look at me and figure, well, you have to be a semi-millionaire or something to do something like this. Jim Leach's father rented my house while we were gone, and he paid me $750 a month rent for the house. And it was a triplex, so he could rent the upstairs out and downstairs out, so it wasn't costing him that much. But I got $750 a month rent. I went through all the bills, fuel, food, everything. Haul outs, repairs. You ready for this? It worked out to $250 a month. Not only that, But I paid 38,000 for Santana, and after we returned, I sold it for 55,000. So I recommend the trip if you need money. I know Marty and I have thought many times looking back on this trip, and both of us have the same feeling. Thank God for a wonderful time and having made it. What a memory. So I hope you enjoyed the pictures and stories as much as we sort of enjoyed the trip itself. It was a unique experience, and I am just totally indebted to my son and daughter-in-law, Charlie and Laurie, for putting this whole thing together. And they've taken hours and hours to make this a recorded historical event.
It also
And I thank them.
it also inspired us to relive all of the memories, which was the best part.
Thank you very much. Okay, and Jim Leach turned to me. I didn't put in this. Jim Leach turned to me in the height of that storm, and the mizzen's gone, and it's blowing, and it's horrible. And he says, "The good news is we're only 4 miles from land. The bad news is it's straight down." I remember him saying that to me.
But also, the things you and I say to each other, like sitting out here and just looking out and being happy to just sit on a swing or sit on a stool or sit on the sofa and just enjoy boredom, because after you've done so much and been through, boredom is good. I mean, it means everything's all right.